I'm Maraniss here, but I'm Maraniss in real life. And I'm really delighted to be here with the scholar Amy Bass and the spectacular Daniel James Brown. And I'm going to ask for a point of personal privilege here at first, because there's something about me being asked to participate in this particular event, a memorial for John Malcolm Brennan, which when I saw it yesterday for the first time that's what this was, I virtually broke down in tears. This is the reason. My father was a student at the University of Michigan in the 1930s, the editorial editor of the Michigan Daily, at a time of sort of radical movement in Michigan, with great writers including Arthur Miller and John Chardy and John Malcolm Brennan, who was one of my father's friends. And when my parents were married on December 16th, 1939, their most prized gift was a book of William Blake's poetry given to them by John Malcolm Brennan with a little poem inside that is in the book that I just wrote about my father and the Red Scare. For Elliot and Mary, not pyramids nor carillons with bells may say your special wisdom to the earth, who are its fabulous inheritors. So thank you, Arlo and everybody, for having me up here for this special night. We're going to just have a conversation. I'm kind of the crypto moderator, but with these two, they don't really need I'm a player coach. They certainly don't need a coach. And there's so much for us to talk about with politics and the Olympics. But just briefly beforehand, we're going to do a little bit of origin story of how the three of us, a scholar and two nonfiction writers who've written about many other subjects, got to the Olympics. And we'll start with Amy and her saga of how she came to publish a book about the Olympics.
Yeah, my first book, Not the Triumph but the Struggle, is about the 68 Games. It's a civil rights history about Tommie Smith and John Carlos and the movement behind their Black Power gesture on the victory podium of the 200 meters, the Olympic Project for Human Rights, one of the really critical intersections of sports and politics in the 20th century. And it started as my doctoral dissertation, but it started as just a tiny part of my doctoral dissertation because, as young as I am, you still don't write about sports in a serious way in academia as your first project. So every incredibly wise advisor and truly trying to take care of me and whatever career I might forge kept saying, don't just write about something in sports. And so the Olympics were but one thing of this much larger project about citizenship and culture and understandings of Black power and civil rights in the United States. But then, as a poor graduate student, I took a job with NBC Olympics to work on their research team leading into the 1996 Atlanta Games. And ended that several-month stint of 50-hour days on the infield of the closing ceremony. And ostensibly, I was there to point out important athletes to the cameraman I was with, but the closing ceremony is an enormously drunk festival of athletes from all over the world who can't understand anything they are all saying to each other, and yet they're having the best time of their lives. So the cameraman was on his own, and I just went with it and got back to my graduate program and said, yeah, it's just going to be the Olympics, and you all are going to have to deal with it. And it became my first book, and you're really defined by your first book. So from that point on, the Olympics were really central. And 8 Olympic Games later with NBC, they're still there.
Daniel?
The origins of The Boys in the Boat is actually a neighbor of mine. I'm going to talk about this more fulsomely tomorrow night, but the condensed version is about 9 years ago, a neighbor came to me, and she'd been reading one of my earlier books to her 90-year-old father, and he liked that book and he wanted to meet me. So I went down and I met this elderly gentleman named Joe Rance. And We talked just for a few minutes about that earlier book, and then the daughter, Judy, began to quite systematically prod her father into telling his story about growing up during the Great Depression, which was very interesting, but more specifically narrowing into his experiences when he began to row for the crew at the University of Washington starting in the fall of 1933. And how he and this 8 other young men had come together and become, over several years, arguably the greatest collegiate crew in history, although Joe would never, ever have said that. And how they went on and wound up rowing for an Olympic gold medal against Germany in Berlin in 1936 in front of Adolf Hitler. And as Joe was telling me this story, I just became absolutely mesmerized by it. And I knew right away that I wanted, most likely, to write a book about it. So I began the next day digging into all sorts of aspects of the story. You know, I knew Joe was a really great guy, but it could have been Joe and 8 jerks in a boat, for all I knew, that first day. So I undertook what turned out to be a several-year process of digging into the story and meeting the family members of the other 8 guys in the book. And it doesn't always work this way when you start a book project. Sometimes what seems like a great topic just doesn't go anywhere. With this one, new doors just kept opening. As I met the other family members, as I began to read about the history surrounding it, as I learned something about the sport of rowing, it just got more and more interesting. And one of the things that was most interesting to me was the extraordinary measures to which the Nazis went at the 1936 Berlin Olympics to portray Germany as something other than what it really was becoming. I mean, I think everybody generally knows that the Nazis used those games to promote their ideology and used it as propaganda. But I was just gobsmacked by the degree of the cynicism and the calculations and the extent to which the Germans went preparing for those games, carrying them off, covering them, projecting the imagery from them around the world. It was just absolutely staggering. So I wound up writing probably 10,000 words more about that whole thing than is actually in The Boys in the Boat, because I was just so interested in it. But I've since finishing that book, I've continued to think about it and be amazed, or to be intrigued by what it means, by this intersection of politics and sports in the context particularly of the Olympics. I mean, I think it falls into a couple categories. One is, to what extent is it reasonable for a host nation to project an image to the world and to promote an ideology? So what does this host nation, what role do they play in terms of politics? But then also, of course, what role do individual athletes play on the stage of the Olympics? And where's the line? What is a reasonable expression of a political ideology in that context, and what is not? And for me, both those questions, both the state question and the private, either the athletes or some outside actors, I really honestly don't know the answer to where the line is in either of those situations. So I'm hoping maybe we can work
we'll
towards
explore that fully, I hope. And from your original being mesmerized, you mesmerized the world after that.
Oh, thank you.
I have to be obsessed with a subject to write a book about it. And of the larger books that I've written, the one, Rome 1960, was the one that came to me mostly by accident of all of them. I write about politics a lot with biographies of Clinton and Obama, and sociology with books about the city of Detroit and the Vietnam War, and also sports. And I was just researching my book on Roberto Clemente, when this idea came to me, because Roberto Clemente's first bit of fame was in 1960 when the Pittsburgh Pirates were on their way to winning the National League pennant and then the World Series. And so I spent a month, this was before newspapers.com when you could do it in a week. Yeah. I spent a month going through microfilm of the 1960 newspapers, in September in particular, late August, early September, and kept seeing these incredible names on the front of the sports sections. Cassius Clay, Wilma Rudolph, Bebe Bikila, Rayford Johnson. It just bowled me over. The names that have been so much a part of my own childhood were right there at those Rome Olympics. That wasn't enough for me to do the book. I try not to do a sports book unless it has several larger themes to it. And very quickly, I came to understand that I could use the Rome 1960 Olympics with the advantage of it being in one place, but the entire world there for 18 days, to tell the story of the emergence of the modern world. Those were the first televised Olympics. It was the first drug scandal. It was the first time an African American carried the American flag. It was the first time a sub-Saharan non-colonial African won a gold medal. It started right after Gary Powers was shot down in the U-2 incident and ended right before Nikita Khrushchev sailed to the United States to pound the table at the UN. The Cold War was central to it. There were people defecting during those days in Rome. It was the emergence of women with the wonderful Tiger Bells of Tennessee State University. All of these subjects that I could write about just through that. And so once I quickly realized that, I knew that this was a book that I would be obsessed with, and that's where we started. Now, since this seminar began, the news in the Olympics has been just sort of amazing over the last 2 days. And Amy's going to take us there further with a description of what's happened with what's called Rule 50.
Rule 50 of the Olympic Games is why political protest at the Olympic Games is not supposed to happen. It outlines very specifically that there's not supposed to be any demonstrative religious or political identities going on. And this is about an event in which your national identity is how you enter, that it's an event that starts with a flag parade. So it's an inherently political event. But Rule 50 is long-standing, and Rule 50 is why, for example, last August, Americans Gwen Berry and Race Imboden were sort of censured, warned, after Gwen raised a fist at her medal ceremony, and Race went down on bended knee, the fencer, during his medal ceremony. And because the Pan Am Games are also under the Olympic Charter, Rule 50 was trotted out, and they were scolded. But yet, 2 days ago, the Athletes Commission of the International Olympic Committee gave guidelines to Rule 50, a 3-page document proclaiming that sport is neutral, which can't be true because they need a 3-page document to tell you what you can and can't do. Right. So the Athletes Commission has explicitly now outlined that things like kneeling or raising a fist are now specifically no gray area under Rule 50. And so yet again, the IOC is deciding which politics are okay, bringing the Koreas together, for example, during an opening ceremony and celebrating unification, and which politics aren't okay. And as Megan Rapinoe tweeted yesterday, maybe they should take a look at what we're protesting rather than how we're protesting it.
And Amy, before we go to Daniel and the protests against the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, isn't it true that the Olympics sort of finally acknowledged John Carlos and Tommy Smith only recently? So it will be 40 years from now when...
Yeah, well, we do this over and over again. We do this as an entire culture, that Muhammad Ali goes from being ostracized to, lighting the flame in 1996 in Atlanta. That Tommy and John are welcomed to the White House by Obama. They were not welcomed to the Nixon White House, the winningest track and field team at that point in U.S. history. We repatriate athletes after we have some hindsight. We do it with protesters. You know, these are how postage stamps are created. We make people okay again. But then we forget, because we now have Colin Kaepernick, who's you know, using his athletes work really hard to build these platforms for themselves, and then they decide how they're going to use them. But we do have these governing bodies that decide how they're going to use them, and the United States Olympic Committee is, you know, Scott Blackman not too long ago said it's a form of patriotism, that they're doing this to make their country better. You know, Race and Gwen at the Pan Am Games said there is a lot of stuff going on in the United States, and we have a very unusual spotlight with which to shed light on what's going on at the border and guns and, you know, on and on and on and on and on, that America's in crisis, and we have a spotlight to do something with it. And I'm sure Gwen and Race, you know, down the road will also be lauded for their bravery at the time. We just don't do it when it happens.
There was a pretty massive effort on the part of Jewish communities in the U.S. to prevent the U.S. from going, or to convince them not to go, right?
In 1936.
In 1936.
So yeah, I mean, it's really interesting story. You know, the Holocaust hadn't really begun to unfold in 1936, but by 1936 there had been a lot of very systematic violence and repression addressed against Jews in Germany. In the 1935, the time of the Nuremberg rally, the Nazi government passed what was called the Blood Laws. And among other things, it prohibited intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews. And very fundamentally, it stripped Jewish Germans of their citizenship, which meant they essentially had no civil rights at all. And there had been boycotts and outright incidents of violence directed at Jews throughout Germany since, well, even before 1933, when the Nazi Party finally achieved power. So there was quite a bit of awareness, at least in the Jewish American community, particularly in New York, of what was beginning to unfold. But the reality is most Americans didn't want to hear about that. I think most Americans viewed whatever was happening in Germany as some of that European stuff left over from World War I that they didn't want to have anything to do with at all. So there was a quite strong effort to boycott the 1936 Berlin Olympics. That effort was ultimately defeated largely through the offices of Avery Brundage, the American Olympic Committee chair, who, Avery Brundage was I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and he was the benefactor of the Asian art collection in the Young Museum there. So I grew up thinking of Avery Brundage as a very benign and positive.
He's the villain in all of our books.
I was going to say, he actually, it's kind of amazing that Avery
come up in
Brundage
here?
is the bad guy in every
Yeah.
book, yeah.
So Brundage and people like him eventually very forcefully shut down the boycott effort, and it failed, although it failed narrowly, and of course the games went ahead. And, it's also an interesting question. I mean, I personally, in retrospect, if I was asked, should the United States have boycotted the Berlin Olympics, I would say absolutely they should have boycotted the Olympics. So it's hard to put yourself back in that place. The problem with boycotts, of course, is that a lot of athletes have worked very, very hard to go to these games. We wouldn't have had the Jesse Owens story. We wouldn't have had the Boys in the Boat story. But given the extraordinary nature of what was happening in Germany, I think obviously the boycott should have succeeded.
Boycott is so difficult. In '68, the black athletes threatened to boycott. The Olympic Project for Human Rights have a list of 6 demands, including the restoration of Muhammad Ali's heavyweight title, that if they aren't met, they will boycott. And it was so hard to get individuals who, as you say, had worked so hard for this goal And they knew that if everyone didn't do it, it wouldn't matter.
Right.
So they went, but they went with the idea that they would use that spotlight to then shed whatever light they could on their moment. So that idea of do you go or do you not go? But of course, 68 is when all of Africa threatened not to go unless South Africa was expelled. And the IOC did do that under pressure to
Right.
make sure that Africa would attend. So sometimes just the threat of a boycott
Yeah.
can get you
All of
somewhere.
those fault lines were just starting to show in 1960 in Africa, in China, in Germany, and race in the United States. 1960 was when the Chinese withdrew from the games after participating 4 years earlier, mainland China, because Taiwan was participating. Taiwan almost protested the games because they had to be called Taiwan instead of China. The movement to get apartheid South Africa out of the games began in 1960, but a representative of black South Africans came to Rome, and Avery Brundage wouldn't even meet with him yet. And 8 years later, it started to happen. There was also an incipient effort to get Rayford Johnson not to go, not to carry the flag. Harry Edwards is just starting that movement. It didn't get nearly as far as it almost did in '68, but it started in 1960. And then the Germans, interestingly, were forced by Avery Brundage to compete as one team, even though East and West Germany hated each other.
Yeah.
And so that was another fraction that was going to start soon as well. So in all those ways, there were no real protests in Rome except by the Italian Communist Party, which hated everything about it. But all of those movements were just starting at that point. Let's get a little deeper into Avery Brundage, because I find him such a fascinating character. I mean, not only did he push to have them go, but he was conspiring with the Nazis.
Yeah, well, I mean, it wasn't Brundage himself, but it was one of his lieutenants whose principal argument was Germany was excluding Jews from their national team. And his argument was, well, Jews aren't allowed at my country club. Why should the Germans allow them in their games? There was a lot of anti-Semitism in this country. There still is. But in the 1920s, 1930s, it was a kind of respectable anti-Semitism, if you will. It was country club anti-Semitism. And Brundage was very much a part of that. And I didn't realize that when I started the project, but I came to I just wanted to read quickly. There's a letter that somebody published in the New York Times just about the time the U.S. team arrived in Berlin. And it's prescient, and I think it deserves being read here. It's somebody named Richard Wingate writing in a letter to the New York Times. Mr. Brundage has reached his destination, the utopia of sportsmanship and goodwill, where Nazi beer and Jewish blood flow freely, where Hitler-made robots torment and persecute the living dead. For 2 months, the dead will be buried, but with the conclusion of the Olympics in September, their graves will be desecrated, and dead men once more will walk the streets of Germany. I mean, this is several years before the Holocaust really, was beginning to unfold. So there were a lot of people that knew what was unfolding, and a lot of people, as I say, didn't want to hear it.
And the propaganda was kind of chillingly echoing all these decades later.
Absolutely, and
so
that's
many ways.
part of what's so interesting to me about the whole propaganda effort surrounding the Nazi games is, I don't want to get partisan here or any.
Go ahead.
Well, no, I'll avoid
You're
being
among
partisan,
friends, Dan.
but it has been really frightening me the last couple of years, observing how willing people can be to set facts aside and let anger and prejudice rule their political thinking and their decision making. It's just gotten more clear to me in the last couple of years. growing up, I always wondered, how could the Germans have done this? How could this have happened in a country like Germany? And
And now you can.
I'm beginning to understand more than I wish I did how it happened in Germany.
Well, and I think one of the things that we assume about sport, or that we would like to assume about sport in terms of saying it transcends politics, right? Which was always Avery Brundage's calling card. It's how he got promoted in '36 from just being the head of the U.S. What is now the U.S. Olympic Committee to becoming the International Olympic Committee's president, is that sports are supposed to be factual. Right? Because it's supposed to be a level playing field, and it's timed, or you can see the finish, or what have you. But if you take the context within which the contest takes place, and you look at something like the call for South Africa to be expelled in '68 because of apartheid policies, they were holding, the IOC first said to them, you have to hold trials. And they said, fine, we'll hold separate trials. So they had separate trials for white and black athletes. And then it was sort of, well, this black athlete beat this white athlete by the time. And they'd say, well, quoting, 0.1 seconds doesn't count. count. And so even when you have times in competition, that political context eats that alive in a way and makes it exactly what you're saying. 0.1 seconds doesn't really count.
All right, exactly.
Avery Brundage operated under the fallacy of thinking that he could keep politics out of the Olympics, along with his even bigger fallacy of amateurism, the sham of that. And everything that we've all reported and seen about the Olympics is that it oozes with politics and with sociology. And that's a larger point I want to make to this audience about this seminar, which is sort of, for a long time I write about many different things, but when I write about sports, people say, oh, you're going to the toy department, which is a phrase that David Halberstam used when he would go from his other subjects to sports. And I would say that's exactly wrong, that politics actually can be very trivial at times, and sports can have the most deeply important sociological lessons in it. Absolutely. And explorations of not just of individual stories, but of movements and of large ones, women, gender, race, all of these sociological movements that define ourselves come through sports as clearly as anywhere else.
Absolutely.
Well, and I think not just in overt politics.
Right.
When I think about the span between my first book on '68 and my most recent book, which couldn't be less about the Olympic Games, it's about a high school soccer team in Maine. Their politics is just in the fact that where they are and what they're playing and how well they're playing it, right? Their politics is in their performance, much like Owens was in '36. Whereas if I look at '68, it's an overt, it's a black-gloved fist being raised over a head while the American flag is being raised and the Star-Spangled Banner is being played. So I think that, the political doesn't even need to be overt action for it to be embedded in the competition.
Let's get into race a little bit and start with Carlos and Tommy and sort of the essence of that.
Yeah, Harry, there'd been talk of black athletes using sport. Al Whitfield had sort of said it. Dick Gregory had recommended that black athletes should organize. You had individual figures, right? The Jesse Owenses, the Joe Louis, these kinds of figures, Jackie Robinson. But '68 marks a collective action. It marks a social action. It marks a social movement. And it created a list of demands. It aligned itself with folks like Louis Lomax and MLK to give itself sort of civil rights legitimacy while borrowing sunglasses and black berets and black gloves from the Black Panthers, sort of to have that performative racial moment. And I think that the thing that Tommy and John do when they take the podium, and I want to give a shout out to Peter Norman, the Australian, who took the silver and wore one of their badges and was really ruined in Australia for doing that, for aligning himself with African Americans. The thing that they did was they really showed that athletes don't stop being who they are when they step onto the field or the track or the court or the pitch, and that it was so rare for a Black individual in the United States to have this kind of global stage. You know, the 60 is the first television broadcast, but 68 is when Roone Arledge and ABC make the Olympics 44 hours of coverage, which, you know, NBC does 44 hours of coverage in the first 10 minutes of the game right now. But it was a huge deal. They had to, you know, Mexico City got its telecom system because of what ABC wanted to do with this Olympic Games. They built these phone lines and these telecom possibilities. And these athletes refused to stop being who they were and what they believed in the name of team and country, which is why it's so interesting that we're still talking about this in the last 48 hours with Rule 50 being explained by a 3-page document. And the IOC saying there are no politics, sports are neutral. Tommy and John and the OPHR said, you know, a long time ago, no, they're not.
And Daniel, I think that the one strongest argument that people would make about going to Berlin was Jesse Owens.
Sure. I mean, it is a great American story. And actually, one of the things kind of reaffirming in my research was realizing that this was the era of Jim Crow still, of course. Despite that, the American press very much championed Jesse Owens. I mean, it underscored this dramatic confrontation between Hitler and his ideology, and not just Jesse, but the African-American athletes on that team and their spectacular successes. And they celebrated it, by and large. I mean, I'm not sure what some country paper in Georgia might have had to say about it. Right. But by and large, the press underscored it as a fundamentally American story, something that we could all be proud of, something that was a matter of national pride, and so the story became myth, and it's.
Did Jesse Owens understand the symbolic weight that he was carrying as he ran down?
I don't know. I mean, I'm no expert on Jesse Owens. I think he did. Yeah. I think probably all the Black athletes there felt it to some extent. There was a general sense amongst the American public that Hitler was a bad guy, and that he was a bully. And obviously, I think most Americans realized he was promoting a racist agenda. But nevertheless, the reality is the propaganda surrounding those games was so successful. The Germans did such an extraordinary job in terms of the imagery and everything about it, that most Americans who went to those games, both the athletes and spectators that went and came back, by and large, they came back to the United States with very positive things to say about this new Germany. It was clean, it was efficient, it was well run. The Nazis the Nazis literally turned Berlin into a movie set in preparations for that game. They got down on their hands and knees and scrubbed the sidewalks. They removed Der Stürmer, the virulently racist magazine, from stands on the streets. They rounded up the Roma and sent them to an encampment at a sewage treatment plant, and then later to Dachau, where they all disappeared. They put books back in bookstores temporarily. They hung banners with what to us now are the evil symbols of swastikas, but to most Americans didn't mean anything. They draped Berlin in all these flags and all these symbols. And they provided extremely efficient, modern medical facilities for the athletes, amazing press facilities for the visiting press. So they created an impression of Germany that was extremely positive, and most foreign visitors came home with that kind of impression about the place.
Which is really what every Olympic city tries to do.
Yeah.
Atlanta sweeps away its homeless population and its tent cities and paves all the roads, and Athens makes sure that for 2 weeks cab drivers take you to where you actually want to go. But these are, this is the performance of the Olympic City, which is an act of politics unto itself. It's who a city thinks it wants to be rather than who a city might actually be.
And I guess that's where the question really gets interesting to me. I mean, I think going back to the ancients, I'm reasonably sure that when Sparta and Athens and Corinth met, all of them were playing for national pride. There was a kind of propaganda going on, or a city-state pride. They were trying to impress one another. So at what point is it legitimate for a nation to show the face it wants to the outside world? And at what point does it become the Nazi Olympics? I mean,
Right, well,
it's a different...
That's not even a fine line, though.
Yeah, well, no, in that case, it's not a fine line. But that's the point. It's
Yes.
just, you have both those things on a spectrum.
But the Greeks, I do think had, the idea of Olympic truce comes from the ancient games. It comes from the Greek word ekechidea. And it was, the tale of King Iphitos going to the Oracle of Delphi and saying, how can we stop war? The Olympic Games were to disrupt the narrative of war.
Right.
And to let people experience what it would be like to live in a world without war. So I think that while it was absolutely, competition, which is always about showing who you are and what you can do, it was also to create sort of space to understand that maybe someday this is what we're going to all be able to grab.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to yank it back to race just for a second to tell two stories about it. One outside of the United States and one inside, and one which was purposely has to do with race, and one which just symbolically was so powerful. The other night, a speaker talked about Zola Budd running barefoot, and she did in practice, but in 1960, for the marathon, everybody was lining up to begin the race, and the American runners looked over at this little guy, number 11, without any shoes on, and said, well, there's one guy we don't have to worry about. It was Abebe Bikila running in Rome for Ethiopia in a country that had invaded his homeland, had used mustard gas in Ethiopia during their conquering of that country in Africa. And Abebe Bikila, no one had heard of at that point, running barefoot through the cobblestone streets of Rome. He gets halfway or a little more into the race, sees the obelisk of Axum, which Mussolini had stolen from Ethiopia and brought back to Rome, and he took off. And he won that race in what was then the best time ever in a marathon. And the power, the symbolism of that throughout all of Africa, of defeating colonialism with this little barefoot runner, was something that is talked about forever among not just Ethiopians, but he's the one African athlete who can transcend the internecine struggle. So in Washington, D.C., most of the cab drivers are either Ethiopian or Somalian or Eritrean, and they all love Abebe Bikila because of what he represented. The other story is about the Tiger Bells of Tennessee State University, this historically black school in North Nashville where they had a beat-up track. It was only half of a track. They had no scholarships. This was long before Title IX. When they would travel to compete against other schools in the South, other black schools, they had to take 2 station wagons, and they couldn't stop at the gas station, so the women in the back had to say, it's time to hit the fields if they had to go to the bathroom. And out of that, the coach didn't have an office. He shared an office with his wife, who was the postmaster of the school. And out of that came the greatest track and field team in history from that little school. And in Rome, led by Wilma Rudolph, they won 3 gold medals. They were the darlings of the world. She was called the Black Gazelle in every different language. And they came home, and in her hometown of Clarksville, Tennessee, they wanted to throw a party for her, a celebration. And Wilma said, no, not unless it's integrated. And Tennessee was completely Jim Crow at that point. And They had to integrate it, and so she forced that and became, she was not saint like she had her own flaws, but she was a beacon of power of women and of race at the same time. I think you could argue if you were to put a Mount Rushmore of women athletes, Wilma would be on it.
Yeah, and I think that she shows, one of the pieces, we've talked about sort of state performance, and we've talked about organic, athletes sort of as organic intellectuals creating political action. But, the State Department takes Wilma, they use Jessie, and they send them on these tours, that athletes become part, along with jazz musicians and whatever, that in this Cold War period, when post-colonial Africa increasingly is making the United States sort of show that its own house is clean despite Jim Crow, Wilma is one of those faces that they send off on a world tour to say, look at this, and she goes.
And it showed the hypocrisy that the Soviet Union was taking advantage of at that point. America claims it's the beacon of liberty around the world, and yet its best athletes are treated as second-class citizens.
Yeah.
So it really, in that way, I would say that many of those athletes in that period forced the United States into dealing with civil rights because of the impact of the Soviet Union's arguments against what was going on here.
And it also gave sort of a false notion of the United States to these decolonizing nations. One of the things that Student Nonviolent, that SNCC found out when they did their tours of Africa was that there was these sort of ideas that African Americans were so well off, and it turned out that an awful lot of that came from the fact that when shipments of aid would go to these countries, they packed them in issues of the Sporting News. And so in the Sporting News, everything looked incredibly integrated. Had they sent the New York Times as the shipping material, it might have looked a little different.
Dan, what were the issues or the hypocrisies of amateurism in 1936? Were they showing themselves yet?
Yeah, well, I mean, and the thing I'm writing about, the rowing, there never really has been, well, actually, there were professional rowers. The sport of rowing, just a digression, arose out of, in the 18th century and 19th century, boatmen on the Thames basically were cabbies that would carry people and freight back and forth across the Thames. And they would, in the 18th century, they began to stage these boat races, these rowing races. The sport, that's the only time rowers have ever been professionals. But so the guys I'm writing about in 1936, these rowers that went to Berlin couldn't be more amateur. I mean, these were a bunch of kids that came out of the woods in Washington State. They were loggers and fishermen, and they literally had no money to go to Berlin. One of the real interesting things about that story is that even after they won the right to represent the United States in Berlin, the AOC came to them and said, well, you have to pay your own way. And they didn't have, 2 nickels to rub together. So folks back in Seattle began to sell little badges for 50 cents a piece, and the citizens of Seattle actually raised the money to send them to Berlin. So they were the ultimate amateurs. Mm-hmm. And they didn't face professional rowers in the Europeans, but particularly with the Germans, the German teams were very well funded. They were, the club that rowed against my guys was the Viking Club in Berlin, which was a very well-funded organization supported by the Nazi state. And so, although it wasn't, amateurs against professionals, there was already sort of a difference creeping in there.
Yeah. 68?
Well, 68, we have one of the first sort of big scandals around amateurism versus professionalism because of the role of Adidas, which was not the official shoe. And so there were, there's lots of different ways to read the protest that takes place with Smith and Carlos, and there's lots of symbolism beyond the black glove fist, but one of the things that people have been analyzing and reanalyzing is the fact that they wear black socks without shoes. And there were, Tommy has said it was to symbolize poverty, and Harry Edwards has talked about different things. And one of the things was that they couldn't wear the official shoe on the podium of the Olympic team because they had contracts with Adidas. So the Adidas scandal, and if you flash forward to the Barcelona Olympics, when the U.S. men's basketball team sort of takes the gold back, and you have them all wrapped up in American flags looking oh so patriotic, it's because they were all under contract to Nike, and they were wearing a Reebok sweatsuit, which was the official U.S. team uniform. So I think, all the way back in '68, they're barefoot on a podium, and we can interpret it however we want politically, but these are the things that they have to deal
You
with.
actually have that story in 1960.
Okay.
Not with an American, but with Armin Hari, who won the 100-meter dash. And he was paid by both Adidas and Puma, the brothers. And he wore one Puma and one Adidas on the stand.
Beautiful.
And there's one other story, very quickly, of the sham of amateurism. It's easy for a multimillionaire like Avery Brundage to say everybody should be an amateur. But most of the athletes had no money. Right. And so it was a huge contradiction going all the way back. But one little story, Lee Calhoun, who was a great high hurdler, was banned for a year because he got married on a show called Bride and Groom, and his wife got a washing machine. And finally, it was only because all of the Midwestern AAUs protested so heavily with Brundage that they threatened to not give them any more money that they allowed Calhoun to participate in the 1960 Olympics. I think we have time now for 10 minutes for some questions for people who'd like to ask.
Looking forward to 2020, what do you see as political flashpoints in the Japanese Olympics?
I think climate change is going to be a huge one because they moved, the last time Tokyo hosted a games, they had to move a lot of the distance running events to earlier in the day because of the summer heat of Japan. And if you flash forward to the summer of 2020, there's going to be temperatures in the hundreds every day. So I think that climate change and sustainability of these global events is going to be front and center in Tokyo.
Amateurism, of course, is no longer an issue. I'm sure there'll be, the whole issue of doping and the Russians and who's been disqualified and who will get let back in will be a source of controversy and probably other issues like that.
Could you please talk about the politics around the committees itself, the Olympics, and then how the cities and the countries are chosen? That has been very controversial, that people taking bribes.
Yeah, it's basically bribery all the way through.
Although now they're bribing in the reverse way because no one wants to host. So the IOC is sort of, it's no longer a buyer's market.
Right. But there are so many examples of, the corruption of the IOC members who vote on that and how they're wined and dined and literally paid money. So I can't think of any Olympics that didn't have some measure of that, even including the ones here in the United States.
Especially Salt Lake was really what broke it wide open.
Yeah. Bob Costas was fired from any further coverage of the Olympics for making observations in the China Olympics about things that have been going on, destroying homes and so on, and has apparently severed all of his relationships with NBC because of that. Could you comment on the role of the media, particularly the television networks, in not covering all these issues that you're talking about?
Well, there perhaps are more issues in one place at one time at the Olympics, but for the most part, the relationship between the television networks and sports in general is corrupt morally, in the sense that the most of the commentators are under pressure not to deal with the most controversial things that are going on right in front of their nose. So people like Bob Costas, Howard Cosell in his era in various times, who had the guts to really say what was going on, are treated in some fashion, not quite as seriously as the athletes who protest.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of the places where sports writers are really a place to support and stick with.
Yes.
Because sports writers have always been able to lead that the necessary conversations when they need to happen. So I think that the written word still wins this one over the very complicated relationship that broadcast television has with sports. Which isn't to say sports writers are perfect.
I hate to dump more on Brundage, but I can't help myself.
Go for it.
You go for it. We're fine with that.
Dan, would you elaborate on how, under Brundage's influence, that the finals of the 880-yard dash, or maybe it was the, not the dash, the relay, where they replaced, I think it was Bill Stern, because he was Jewish, with another runner?
I can't really speak to that. I just don't know enough about that. Do you?
Well, I mean, it happened.
Yeah, I
So
mean, that-
why it happened is in the ether, and there's been some really good stuff written about it, but it's, yeah, I mean, it happened.
Yeah.
I have one more Brundage piece, which goes back to what will be my next book, which is about Jim Thorpe, who won the decathlon and pentathlon in 1912. And we all think of Avery Brundage as this corpulent, fat cat, millionaire, high on the hog, art collector. He actually was a decathlete in 1912. And Jim Thorpe cleaned his clock. And of course, Jim Thorpe's medals were taken away from him for bogus reasons. And for many decades, the key person preventing him from getting those medals back was Avery Brundage.
But that really speaks, think about that, 1912 decathlon. And then you look at all the way through to Munich, the games must go on, which is Avery Brundage after the massacre of the Israeli team. The games must go on. He pretty much is the 20th century for the Olympic movement. Yep. Bad guys go down hard.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you've talked fascinatingly about the Olympics' role in determining race, but I'm really interested in, I know Caster Semenya and others have been disqualified for hypertestosterone, and the IOC is one of the few organizations on earth that has taken on this weird role of deciding what is female. Is it hormones? Is it genetics? And I was wondering if you could talk about the sort of cultural impact and how the Olympics has taken on this role of determining who's a man and who's a woman.
So, everyone looks at me.
Well, you should.
Gender verification is launched, I think, in '66 at the Commonwealth Games, and it goes away, it comes back. '68 is the first Olympics, actually. Just in case '68 wasn't complicated enough, they launched gender verification testing in the Olympic Games, which was the swabbing of the cheek, but not the swabbing of the, before that it hadn't been the swabbing of the cheek of everyone, only if you sort of looked suspicious. And there's plenty of columns of, don't test the swim team, we know exactly who they are. So it's had this idea of separating sports into these gendered categories to create a protected category. Flash forward to Castor and others, Judy Chan, there's lots of them, who are putting their cases before the court of the arbitration of sport. And Cass has made these decisions against someone like Caster Semenya, who runs the 800 like no one else, because they're protecting a category in international play, and they're doing it and will state that it is discrimination to try to keep her out of this category, that it's unfair, that hypertestosterone, lots of things. And even the very case of testosterone isn't proven, right? We don't have cause and effect science that says testosterone makes you faster. It just doesn't exist. The only scientific study that has ever said that was created by the IAAF itself. So it's very biased science. But when they say that they're keeping someone like Castor or someone like Judy Chand, who has actually since been reinstated for hyperandrogenism, when they're keeping them out to protect the category, they're saying that some biological advantages are okay and some aren't. Michael Phelps is a freak of nature. He has feet that are flippers. He has hands that might as well be webbed. His torso, everything about him. And he is lauded for that. And Caster Semenya is also different and has a biological advantage, and she is barred for that. So I think, the Caster she's fighting, she's heroic, her legal team is heroic, and I can't wait to see where we end up with it, because it's a conversation that we're still very much in the middle of.
And all of it plays out in the context of the incredible sexism of athletics over the course of a century before that, where it was considered unladylike for women to participate.
Not black women. Black women were always allowed to sweat and always allowed to be fast.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But not white women.
But not
Yeah,
white women.
yes.
And even who CAS has been targeting, it tends to be sub-Saharan African athletes.
Right.
We have time for one more question.
It's been a great panel, but you paint a very, very dark portrait of why the Olympics should exist. You look at 36, obviously Nazi Germany, you go up. 68, you're forgetting that as many as 2,000 Mexican students
Were killed.
Yeah.
were killed. 72, you have Munich.
Yep.
Without 76, you would not have Caitlyn Jenner. I don't know if you ever thought about that. 1980, Russia boycotts. 1980, or U.S. boycotts, 1984, Russia boycotts, Chinese displaced millions, Greece went broke, you've had judging scandals, you have every scandal, you've had corruption. So what does it prove? Is it simply enough for the glory of athletic performance? Is it really doing any societal good except to prove the ultra-nationalism of countries and the hundreds of millions of dollars that are spent on training and facilities and jingoistic coverage? The London, 50 pages about the British team. So what's the point? What is the point?
I'm going to try. I think it was a good idea. I think it was a good idea that the ancient Greeks had, and I think it's a good idea to keep trying to make it work. I think everything you said is true, but I still think it's a good idea. I think the concept elevates us. It does, in spite of all that, it does inspire millions of people. And so I think that's the best defense, is just it's imperfect. It has a sad history. We got to make it work better, but I think it's a good idea.
And I think occasionally there are details that support that. The IOC, which, I'm really mad at the IOC right now. But the IOC has also made some really interesting decisions when other world bodies refuse to do that. Banning South Africa and Rhodesia. Condemning Afghanistan because of Taliban rule, demanding in 2012 that every team that attends the 2012 London Olympics fields women on its roster, because up until that point, there were 3 teams that refused to do that. And the IOC saying, if you come, you better field women. So I think that it is an ideal to keep trying for, and I think every once in a while they give us a carrot at the end of that stick that says, we can make some good global decisions, and good global decisions that people care about. No one sits around watching the United Nations sessions all day. We don't have multi-platform cable digital streaming deals for people to watch those kinds of meetings. But we do still for things like the World Cup and the Olympics. And I think exactly as Dan says, keep trying.
You could almost make that argument about every professional sport, Buzz, in some way or another. Football and CTE, or the extravagant amount of money that goes into professional sports, where it could go into other things, building stadiums. So I don't have any defense for it, but I feel like, just like, when I root for the Green Bay Packers and will live or die with them tomorrow night, I feel hypocritical about it because I see the beauty in the sport itself. And so when I was writing this Rome 1960 book and was watching on YouTube and videotape the finals of the decathlon with Rayford Johnson and C.K. Young, and Rayford not being able to, he wasn't a miler at all, but him hanging in there so beautifully, and then the two of them hugging at the end together. It was a beautiful moment. And so, in some ways, we all live for sensations and moments, and the Olympics provide many of those with all of the other flaws, the enormous flaws that are there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.